Well, good afternoon, everyone. I know you're trickling in. This is great. We have such a turnout. We are going to have room on the sides to sit, and please feel free to grab a seat or grab a sandwich. The only sad thing I have to say is we can only go for about an hour. I wish we could go longer, but I'm so glad that you all came to join us this afternoon. As you can just see, we have one of the most distinguished panels we could possibly get together to come talk with us this afternoon. And our afternoon's talk is actually rather broad, and the question we're here to talk about is when we hear about human rights atrocities, what should we do? How should we respond? And I say we as in you and me here in Pepperdine, as law students, as lawyers, but also we as the USA, and also we as the international community. How do we respond to those things, those human rights atrocities we hear? And for example, what really spurred this discussion, this panel, was the Coney 2012 video. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It literally went viral in just a few weeks. It had over 86 million viewers worldwide. Pretty incredible. For those of you who are familiar with the film, you know that Coney 2012 was a video that promoted the arrest of a Uganda war criminal, Joseph Kony, who, among a lot of other acts, brutally coerced the service of children soldiers, and that's what the video was mainly on. Now, the film really was not without controversy, and the reason why there was some controversy is it was rather old. The events that the film talked about really had its height about 6 years ago in Uganda, and since that time, the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Kony, and he's frankly a fugitive on the run. He's probably no longer in Uganda and probably somewhere in Congo, in the bush area. And at this time, Uganda really is not plagued by Kony or his forces. And in fact, last fall, so before the video came out this March, President Obama actually sent 100 elite troops, USA elite troops, to Africa to help find Kony. So it was interesting, and one of the questions that has been kind of floating around out there is, so is the video a net good? Has it raised good awareness? And a much broader question is, when we do become aware of human rights atrocities, going on right now or even in the past, in different parts of the world, in Africa, right now there's so much going on in the Middle East, in Asia or in India or really anywhere in the world, what should we do, if anything? What have we done? What is working and what isn't? And so the panel really is going to address this broader question. We have three speakers. Our keynote speaker is Ambassador Pierre Prosper. Ambassador Prosper is going to have about 15 minutes to speak. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and introduce all of our distinguished panelists so that they can just come up one right after another and give you their thoughts. At the end, there will be some time for question and answers. We will circulate through the talk some index cards, so if you have some questions, if you want to jot them down and then just hand them back forward, I'll be standing over here, and I'll go through them, and just so we can stay on time, I'll see if I can pick out the ones that seem to have the most common questions arising. So Pierre Prosper, thank you so much for coming. Ambassador Prosper is actually an alum of Pepperdine, graduated in 1989. He's currently a partner at Aaron Fox. In 2001, he was appointed as the U.S. Ambassador at Large in charge of the Secretary of State's war crimes issues. In the late 90s, he was actually a prosecutor for the United International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, dealing with the Rwanda genocide, and he broke new ground in international law, wherein he argued in one of his cases, and argued successfully, that rape constituted an act of genocide. We actually study this case in the class that I teach on international criminal law. Before that, he was at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the DA's office. So we're very pleased to have him. And he's actually off to London this evening tonight. So he is a man on the move, and we are very lucky to have him. Professor and Ambassador Kamek, I know many of you know and love him. He served as an ambassador to the Republic of Malta and just came back from that this year to rejoin us here at Pepperdine. While he was the ambassador at Malta, he was instrumental in the resettlement of close to 800 families seeking freedom from the violence in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, we have another beloved faculty member, Judge Einhorn. He is the director of our asylum clinic. He served for 17 years as a federal immigration judge. And prior to that service, he worked at the DOJ, where he prosecuted fugitive Nazi war criminals illegally residing in the U.S. So we have a very great panel. I thank you so much for coming. And again, if you have questions, jot them down on note cards going around, and I'll be down here in the corner. So Ambassador Prosper, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, Professor, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here. It's always good to be back at Pepperdine, and in fact, every time I walk down here, I have flashbacks to my days here and studying, and the wealth of not only information but values and knowledge that I was able to gain here at Pepperdine. So it is a great pleasure for me to be here, and also with this distinguished panel. I only have 15 minutes. And there's a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to try to just jump right into it so that I don't get cut off. International criminal law has its responsibilities. The only way that it can be enforced is by us. It's not necessarily a diplomatic initiative. It's not simply a justice initiative. It is about what you and I do as citizens of this world. The best way to illustrate this is by going back 18 years this week. 18 years this week, a genocide began in Rwanda, 18 years ago. On April 6th of 1994, the plane of the president of Rwanda was shot down. Now, it's in dispute exactly what happened, but what followed is not in dispute. Immediately after the shooting down of the plane, the Hutu militia and the Hutu army began to set up roadblocks in Rwanda. The purpose of the roadblock was to identify whether you were a Hutu or whether you were a Tutsi. They would stop you, ask you for your identity card, and look at it. If you were a Hutu, you got a free pass. If you were a Tutsi, you were put off to the side. And what happened to these people that were put off to the side is the most horrific set of events in modern history, and perhaps even in history. Because what we need to realize is 18 years ago this month, in a 100-day period, 1 million people died. Do the math. 1 million people in 100 days. And they died by the way of machete, clubs, sticks, hand-to-hand confrontation. It began by killing first the moderate Hutus, the people who would get in the way and stop the genocide. They then began to target the Tutsi leadership, politicians, people who could ascend and step up and be a barrier to impunity to stop the violence. They killed them all. Then they killed the intellectuals, the Tutsi intellectuals, the professors, people who could stand up and fill the vacuum, assume leadership, and try to prevent what was happening. And then they began to kill all the fighting age men and boys, systematically, one by one, in horrific fashion. So what we were left with later in the month of April was the elderly, women, and children. Now, among this group of survivors was a woman that we called Witness JJ. And for those of you that have read the Akayesu case, you will be familiar with Witness JJ and her story. In April, she was home when the plane crashed with her family, having a normal evening. Then when the violence began, they began to seek shelter, hide around the house, hide in the bushes. The militia came, the Interahamwe. First they killed her father in a horrific manner, threw him down in a latrine. They killed her brother. And then they came after witness JJ and her sister that we called witness NN. And they sexually violated them in a horrific manner. Witness JJ then was able to escape and flee along with her sister. They decided to separate because it would be better. It would increase their chances of survival. So for a week, she and her sister, going separate routes, tried to get to the city hall, the Bureau Communal, to seek, believing it was a sanctuary, believing that the mayor would rescue them, would save their lives. Along the way, every day she would run into more and more assailants and was violated. I'm not going to go into the details, but you can use your imagination and then take it to the next level as to what happened to her. She finally makes it to the Bureau Communal, thinking that, yes, I'm safe, the mayor will protect me, but only to find out that the city hall was not a sanctuary. It was more of a detention facility where they began to hold the elderly, the women, and the children out in the cold, out in the rain. The elderly began to become sick and would die off. The children would die off. And the women became victims of sexual violence. The militia would go out by day and rape at night. I was sent to Rwanda in the aftermath to deal with this exact issue, with the genocide. For the very first time, the international community was coming together, establishing an international criminal tribunal to prosecute the case of genocide, which had never been prosecuted before, that remained dormant since its passage in 1948. I met witness JJ upon my arrival. We heard about the sexual violence, we heard about all the killings, but we decided that we need to not only prove the case of genocide in Rwanda, but we wanted to put sexual violence, rape, on equal footing. Because in the past, it had never been prosecuted. World War II, anywhere, it was a spoil of war. But we decided we were going to prosecute it as a war crime, prosecute it as a crime against humanity, and for the first time introduce the concept as a form of genocide. When we met witness JJ, she was reluctant to speak. She didn't want to talk about what happened. Because you need to understand at that time and even today, being a victim of sexual violence was taboo. She didn't want anyone to know. She wouldn't talk about it. We spent 8 months just building a trust and a rapport with witness JJ, to the point, to the extent we finally persuaded her to come forward and to testify about what happened to her. We flew her to Arusha, Tanzania, where we set up the courthouse. Now again, this was the very first case of the tribunal for Rwanda and the very first case of genocide. The media was there, CNN, BBC, New York Times, you name it. On the day before witness JJ was scheduled to testify, she came to me and she said, "Mr. Prosecutor, I can't do this. I can't do this. I cannot go out in public, go before a foreign court, both foreign in personnel and foreign in its formation, and tell about what happened to me. I just can't do it." She refused to testify. So I sat her down and I started talking to her. I said, "Witness JJ, it's your choice, but let me tell you a story." And I began to tell her about what happened and what was happening in Bosnia, the rape camps that were established. I told her about other parts of the world where women were subject to sexual violence, rape, and torture. I told her about all the countless of cases or scenarios where these women who were abused never survived and her voice was never heard. And I said to her, you have a choice. You have an opportunity. This is an opportunity for you to make a difference, for you to speak for the voiceless, to speak for those women that came before you and did not have this chance today to point the finger of accusation and say this is wrong. And at that time, the most amazing thing happened. Witness JJ began to lift her head up from this meek position and looked at me and was absorbing every single word that I was saying. And finally she said, I will testify. We brought her to the courtroom the next day, and she would speak with just a whisper, barely telling her story. But as a direct examination went on, and this was an 8-hour process, her voice began to raise and become stronger. She began to look at the accused, Mr. Akayezu, and said, you did this to me. This was wrong. This should not happen. She began to invoke the rule of law. And by the end of the day, her voice was strong, animated, and persuasive. When she went back to the safe house that night and told the other women what happened and what she did, they all would rush up to me and say, I want to be next. I need to tell my story. I want to confront the accused. It was the most amazing experience to watch the rule of law develop. Because the rule of law is not about the textbooks, what we learn here. It's not about the judicial system simply. It is about people and the courage that they display in moments that call for action. And Witness JJ stood up. Now, as we heard, we won that case, which was the first case of genocide in the history of the world. We also, for the first time, put sexual violence on equal footing with other crimes. Now, I had no idea back then that you would be reading about it, you know? But it was a moment in history. I left the tribunal after 3 years of service. I went there thinking I was only going to spend maybe 18 months. But the work was so compelling, the service was so needed, that I ended up staying. I left and came back to the U.S., and as you heard, went on to become the ambassador at large for war crimes issues. In 2004, I had the opportunity to go back to Rwanda for the 10-year commemoration of the genocide. Now, this was a high-level visit. I was invited by the president. I was sent by our president. So I went to functions, events, ceremonies. But I asked our ambassador there at the time, and I said to her, I want to go find Witness JJ. I want to see how she's doing. So they set up a visit for me in the community where she lived. And I remember driving down to Taba, the town. And as we got closer, we was driving up this windy road, and Rwanda is a very beautiful country, lush and green. I began to see these colors on the horizon, yellow, green, red, orange. And as we got closer, I realized that it was the dresses of women. They were wearing their best dress. And as we pulled up to the city hall, the Bureau Communal, I realized that they were all going to the city hall where I was to be. When I got out of the car, I noticed that I was surrounded by a group of approximately 800 women. And I walked into the room, and they began to sing, clap their hands, and dance. They actually even made me dance, which I don't know, I'm not sure if you want to see that, but and at the end of the dancing and the singing, they said, Ambassador Prosper, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for what you did for us in the 1990s. But more importantly, we want to thank you for not forgetting us and coming back here today. Witness JJ was among that group, and I had an opportunity to spend some time with her. While she was still struggling, she was rebuilding the pieces of her life. And at that moment, I realized, while I knew it before, but it really comes home, the point that we as individuals can make the difference. We as individuals have a responsibility to other people. Because back in 1994, no one paid attention to Rwanda. Even as the news was floating out there that 1 million people were being killed, no one paid attention. No one lifted a finger. So what you are doing here today, by raising your awareness, and we'll talk about some of these other issues, is you are in the process of making a difference. You may not realize it now, but it may be at some point, at some time, you will be called to action. You will have a decision to make. Are you going to go to a Rwanda? Or are you going to stay here? Are you going to raise your voice or remain silent? Are you going to contribute to humanity? Thank you.
Professor Kamek is going to run a short video and then have a few brief comments.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mrs. Gonzi, Your Excellencies, the Chief Rabbi, my friend Admore, it's so wonderful to see you sitting next to one of my other great friends in this community, Tommaso Caputo. It makes a wonderful interfaith statement in and of itself. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here this evening to remember. We remember not to denigrate any nation or to indulge in self-righteous indignation, but to learn a lesson that at root teaches something important about ourselves that we dare not forget. That lesson? That the failure to love our neighbor is but a short distance from ignoring our neighbor, and that disregard of our neighbor is but a short distance from silently tolerating political, racial, gender, and other illicit forms of oppression and hate. With the support of the Prime Minister, Karl Borge has made it possible to remember one young victim of the Holocaust, one of an estimated 6 million Jewish victims of murder. The exhibit invites us to remember that the Holocaust is not just a grievous crime against humanity, it is a warning flag against any modern practice that denigrates human life as expendable or manipulable. The Holocaust of the 1940s is of such magnitude of death that it scarcely allows comparison. But let us at least see that the suicide bomber in Moscow, or Madrid, or London, or New York, the slave trader who imprisons young women in prostitution or the drug trade, and the tribal and ethnic madness of Rwanda, Eritrea, the Sudan, the Balkans, Afghanistan, are cousins of the Holocaust, if not siblings. Anne Frank's diary is not a story of defeat, however, but perseverance in the face of adversity. My late father was part of the B-17 Flying Fortress Squadron that is sometimes said to have defeated Germany. But you know, it was not Germany that was defeated, but rather Hitler's misleading madness and hate. Like the noble spirit of Anne Frank, Germany as a people persevered, and today the German nation occupies a position of international achievement in matters of economy and community. Anne Frank's personal recounting of the story of the Holocaust, however, does something very important. It put names on the 6 million. It makes an otherwise incomprehensible crime capable of being felt personally and tangibly. And in feeling the depth of her personal story and the death and the fear of others that she recounts along the way, we see that there are far more victims of the Holocaust and of modern exercises of hate than those whose hair and shoes and eyeglasses and suitcases still line the dismal hall of Auschwitz. I know they still line the dismal hall because I saw it for myself but a few years ago. I know Auschwitz, or really, for me, Auschwitz, because the father of my father, the B-17 bombardier, was a Polish intellectual whose dream and preparation to teach at the world-renowned Jagiellonian in Krakow died when the Kamek family scattered into the United States and England and France to escape the death camps, not as a Jew, but as an intellectual who suffered often the same fate. Years later, while Dean of the Catholic University of America, I would be invited to teach at the Jagiellonian, and I would see firsthand the lists of murdered faculty, a list that very likely would have contained my grandfather's name had he not forfeited his homeland and his scholarly aspirations. Of course, if the name Jan Kiewicz did appear on the long list of humanities and science faculties murdered by the Nazis, I would not be here to remember with you today. Remember what? Certainly not that any single nation, as I said, was intrinsically evil. No, we remember that which animated the hate of the Holocaust can strike any people and any nation. It is a problem of human pride, of self-centeredness, of that most radical rejection of faith that substitutes man's whim for God's command. We also remember that today's hatreds, genocide based on race, religion, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, are the corruptions of the human heart. And those corruptions have collateral effects. You know, it is odd that we call one of those effects irregular migration. For what human being would consciously, that is regularly, stay put in the face of such offensiveness and risk? There is nothing irregular about escaping that. The United States welcomed my grandfather. Today, Malta receives a significant number of migrants for the same reason. The Diary of Anne Frank asks us to remember honestly the common reason for migration, man's inhumanity to man. And having remembered, we are asked one more thing. Not to look the other way in the face of persecution and prejudice and hatred and oppression, but to welcome and help, as best we can, those who have been so mistreated. This is why Malta makes efforts to resettle migrant populations. It is why my embassy and others have been especially privileged to do the same. You see, it is a privilege to help the modern-day equivalents of Anne Frank persevere, for it does something very important. It amplifies love. And in so doing, God willing, alla promette, we will avert the seed of profound hatred represented by the Holocaust from ever again taking root in the human soul. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me share that with you. One value that it has, besides reminiscing about a moment in Malta, is, especially in light of the ambassador's eloquence, a reminder of how this is a consideration, a commitment that is calling to people around the world at this moment. And that where can you help? The answer is right where you are. Eleanor Roosevelt put it very well. She said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual. They are the neighborhood in which he lives, the school, the college he attends, the factory, the farm, the office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." When we speak of these grand concepts of human rights and human dignity, sometimes we think of them as abstractions, but they're not. They are, in fact, the Anne Franks. They are, in fact, the thousands of Eritreans and Somalians and Nigerians and Sudanese, Rwandans that take their life into their own hands and take every bit of their savings and separate from their mothers and fathers and their home villages and the things familiar, and they run the risk of the Mediterranean Sea. Most don't make it. The sea's not that kind. But those who do, we have an obligation to. And it was only 800 that we could help, but it's 800 more than would have been helped otherwise. And it was a bit of a witness to the other 26 nations in the European Union, and it's an embarrassment not to step up for these things. So I know we started this discussion with the Coney video. I know there are many formal people in diplomacy who would say an interference with the silent diplomacy going on, with the assignment of the special troops and so forth. I'm not going to be one of them. Because while the material was a bit old, as Professor Goodnow said, while there's some concern about this particular organization as to the percentage of its commitment and the monies it raises going to good cause, there are so many others working one-on-one, and one doesn't need to limit oneself to one organization. And so if a good piece of music, if a good piece of video inspired you in that moment to Twitter somebody, it's the beginning. It's the beginning. And that's all that's needed. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Those were two very inspired remarks, and I'm humbled by them. In writing the asylum law back in 1980 and in applying it as a judge, I learned a great deal about what motivated people to flee for their lives. And in some cases, it was the offenses that have been outlined in international law, beginning at Nuremberg and continuing to the present day. Crimes of aggression, the planning and waging of aggressive war, war crimes, the violations of the rules and customs of war, such as the mistreatment of prisoners of war and misuse of occupational authority, crimes against humanity, which include mass deportation of civilian populations and other violations against civil populations, and of course now genocide, which deals primarily with the destroying or attempt to destroy various or individual racial, religious, or ethnic groups. These crimes have been recognized because the victims have told compelling stories, beginning, in fact, at the end of World War II and continuing to the present day. But there have been victims whose stories, of course, have not been told in international forums nearly enough. It was said, and it may be apocryphal, that when Hitler discussed with his aides the final solution of the Jewish question, one of his assistants told him or asked him, "Mein Führer, do you think that we will be able to get away with this? Do you really think the world will sit by?" To which Hitler said, "And when was the last time you heard anybody cry and wail about the Armenians?" Our Congress won't even recognize that there was a genocide against Armenia because we have a strategic relationship with Turkey. When we went after the alleged war criminals in the former Yugoslavia and applied diplomatic and military pressure to force the Dayton Accords that largely ended the struggles in Bosnia-Herzegovina, even before the International Court for the former Yugoslavia was able to get hold of Milosevic, Radovic, and Mladic, even before that, we saw in Rwanda that we did nothing. We did nothing. The color of the skins of the 1 million victims in Africa was considerably darker than the white people who were being murdered in Europe. If Rwanda had only had a lot of oil, we would have been there in a New York second, fighting for the victims before Ambassador Prosper ever had the courage and intelligence to apply the means of justice and international law to the perpetrators. When was the last time we militarily intervened to force the arrest of the Sudanese dictator Bashir, who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court? When was the last time we moved against China for its complete subjugation of the Tibetan people? Since China holds most of our national debt, I assume that we're afraid they'd call it in. Now, we go after the perpetrators of terrible crimes, and so we should, but we're very selective about whom we pick. We forced an invasion of Iraq and claimed that Saddam Hussein was guilty of genocide. And that is probably true. But we haven't gone into various other countries to force the arrest of individuals who have perpetrated the very same crimes, because it was not in our national interest to do so. Our interests traditionally overcome our values. Our strategic concerns overcome our moral concerns. We have become much better at prosecuting gross human rights violators, but we still are quite ambivalent about preventing the continuation of genocide, of crimes of aggression, of war crimes, and of crimes against humanity. Because going after Coney, who was indicted or against whom an arrest warrant was executed in 2005, and who is no longer a threat, is much safer than upsetting the apple cart of Africa and going after a Bashir. The statute on genocide, the international law on genocide, both in the Genocide Convention and in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, does not include the crime of cultural genocide. Cultural genocide may be used as evidence of genocide, but it itself is not an international crime. So what's happening in Tibet is not genocide. Nor is anyone pressed for a change in the law, because it's not in our interest to do so, whether or not it would be in our values to do so. The differences in the way one brings alleged war criminals and genocidalists, or génocidaires, as the French call them, to justice vary. And that's a discussion that we really have in this country. There are international tribunals that apply an adversarial system, and where prisoners are held in the dock and expected to listen to the crimes against them and given the opportunity to present defenses. There are other ways of dealing with genocide. In Uganda, some individuals protested the efforts to bring Coney to the International Criminal Court. Instead, they wanted to use the African tradition of matu opu, which is essentially a reconciliation proceeding in tribal villages. This similar system has existed in Rwanda and has been used in part because of tradition and in part because the local courts and the international tribunal have been unable to handle all of the cases of alleged genocidaire. We have not had a serious discussion at the highest levels in our country about whether all of these institutions and procedures should be used and whether we should be aiding and reinforcing local institutions at the same time we use individual institutions. In short, I guess I'm here to give the bad news after 2 inspiring speeches. I think it is important that each one of us stands up against these crimes. But these crimes will continue unless we go up the food chain and hold the generals and heads of state responsible. Prosecuting corporals and colonels just won't stop the violence. And yet, in our own country and in the West, we are very selective about whom we identify for apprehension. We sent 100 people to help in Uganda. Yes, that's a start. We sent 130,000 to Iraq. We've sent tens of thousands to Afghanistan. That is a measure of our strategic interests, or so our government believes. It is not a measure of the values we should apply. The question is not just whether we as individuals will do the right thing, but whether we will force on our governments a conscience to do the right thing. You have to learn in coming out of law school that there are differences and there are differences. In this country, we fight like heck over tax cuts. In the rest of the world, the issues are like this. Fundamentalist warriors who want to destroy whole populations and societies, presidents of Iran who deny the existence of the Holocaust and are building nuclear weapons, while still trading oil with corporations that only now are being sanctioned for doing so. Terrorist groups that have the assistance of military intelligence organizations in countries like Pakistan, whom we regard as a close friend and strategic ally. We have to take some risks, not just as individuals, but as institutions, to bring people to justice. And it will be a measure of our values whether we are willing to create inconveniences for ourselves in order to bridge the decency and indecency gap that still exists, so that one day Ambassador Prosper and people like him, and myself when I went after fugitive war criminals, will have nothing to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for just inspiring remarks from all of our panelists. I already have some questions here, but if you have some, please send them my way. We've only got about 10 minutes, and so we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. The first question to the panelists and Ambassador Prosper, I might have you start the conversation, and then Ambassador Kamek and Judge Einhorn, if you have follow-up comments, we would love to hear them. The question is, if there is a right for humanitarian intervention in international customary law, and if there is that right, who should apply and who should enforce it? Should the U.S., NATO, the United Nations? And just your thoughts on that, and in particular, just because CONI 2012 has raised the awareness of so many people, this room full of people, I'm sure have become very familiar now with CONI. Didn't know about him just maybe a month ago. But now that awareness is getting raised, what is the response, who responds, and what kind of legal authority do we have?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, the issue of whether there's actually a legal right for humanitarian intervention is one of debate. There is what is called the responsibility to protect that diplomats and nations have been discussing. But the reality is it is needed, and there is a way. It does not necessarily have to be the United States or NATO that is out in front. You know, to give you an example, when I was in government, we effectively intervened in two areas. One is Liberia, and the other one was in Darfur. And what we did, the United States, is in Liberia, we sent a big aircraft carrier off the coast of Liberia, and then airlifted the Nigerians and others into Liberia. We did the same thing in Darfur, where we brought the Rwandans and the Nigerians in there for peacekeeping. So I think what we have to do is understand that everyone has a role to play, every country, and we should look at some of the regional actors to get them involved. And there are legal instruments that can be used at the regional perspective. The problem is that if we always look to the United Nations, to the United States or NATO, we're not going to solve the problem because everyone is passing the buck. We have to try to get every nation involved.
And I guess I would second it, not just picking up on some of the criticism or comments of Judge Einhorn. The public side is not always the easiest side to move into action. It's a bit like moving the aircraft carrier. You got to move it very slowly, and you don't even notice it's moving anymore. So that's not to overlook the private side. For example, before the Invisible Children group made itself known with respect to Mr. Coney, for several decades, the Catholic Relief Services has been working in that part of northern Uganda. And among other things, they have coordinated assistance, some from public money, U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, some from another private group, Caritas. And what are they doing? They're helping people recover economically from the terror that was visited upon them by the LRA, which is Coney's group. And so, one of the things that can be done, and it's done one village at a time, one family at a time, one farm at a time, is help with training, help with improved agricultural techniques, help basically restore a sense of identity and respect that the terrorists have taken, that Mr. Coney has taken from them. And none of that has to take place necessarily through the public side, which has all sorts of strategic interests, which by the time you get done dealing with them, oil or whatever, you're too old to do anything with the problem. And also, the fact of the matter is that it's happening right here at Pepperdine as well. We have in the basement downstairs a group called Pachas, that is very responsibly using the techniques of negotiation and mediation and interfaith diplomacy to reach out to the groups, especially in North Africa and elsewhere in the Mediterranean region, to establish frameworks for new governments that will, in fact, prevent this type of genocide and crime against humanity from recurring in those places. And that's happening right here. It's happening, literally right under our nose. And of course, what the work of the asylum clinic is doing is exactly the same. So, yes, the United States is conflicted in many ways. It's conflicted not just in the large ways that the judge spoke of, but just think of Abu Ghraib and just think of, Florida. And one sees the conflict as well. Human rights comes in big packages and little packages, but the private side is there. Often the private side through a faith-based organization is there, and that is an excellent place to work on human rights as well.
Well, I agree with everything said. I think that faith-based and private efforts are critical, particularly in situations which are brewing but haven't boiled over. Because in using those private institutions and faith-based efforts, you often leave people less defensive, and so they're more willing to cooperate. Whereas when government institutions come in, it's almost like you're forcing people into the corner and they act like wounded animals. Now, sometimes that's necessary, especially when large-scale criminality has occurred. But when there's a crisis, the private and faith-based efforts of the Global Justice Mission, of the International Justice Mission, of the Rule of Law project this school has with Uganda, of the efforts that we're now formulating, both the Asylum Clinic and the Global Justice Mission with the Republic of Ecuador regarding the victims of human trafficking. One of my students will be there this summer dealing with that. And all of that constitute an effort to get at these problems when they're percolating, but when they haven't boiled over. That's critical. There should be many fronts in the efforts against massive human rights violations, and sometimes private efforts create less defensiveness.
Ambassador Prosper, some argue that if YouTube, Twitter, or the 24 Hours news cycle existed in the mid-90s, Rwanda genocide would not have been allowed to occur. Do you agree? And if so, how would you explain what's going on in Syria right now? So just your thoughts on that? I know we're kind of looking backwards,
Yeah.
but with the use of social media nowadays and the Twitter generation.
You know, it's hard to say, because while we, the public, did not really know about Rwanda, the governments did. President Clinton, the Security Council, everyone knew exactly what was happening in Rwanda, and they chose not to act. It was a deliberate and conscious choice to not only do nothing, but to pull out the peacekeepers that were actually there on the ground and could have prevented the genocide. There were 5,000 UN peacekeepers there in April 1994. And a couple weeks into the genocide, the UN decided to pull them out. The UN Security Council voted to pull them out in order to spare their lives, leaving a core group of 500 people behind. So there was some reporting, but the governments chose to ignore it. Now, whether Twitter, Facebook, and so on could have made a difference, yeah, I don't know. But it was very clear that the international community, including the United States, did not want to put boots on the ground in Rwanda to stop the genocide.
Ambassador Kamek, maybe you can answer this one, and then Judge Einhorn, Ambassador Prosper, if you want to follow up. Where is the line between becoming involved in prosecuting criminals and becoming the world police, and also in dealing with national sovereignty issues? How do we respond to that?
Well, with regard to crimes against humanity, war crimes, this is not something that's protected by sovereignty, nor should it be. The notion that it was is a notion that hopefully we've set aside since World War II. And that's the insistence we have to have. Of course, the way to manifest that is with respect to our own behavior as well. And so we don't resist the jurisdiction of courts when it's needed to prosecute our own people. And we apply that jurisdiction to others in the same even-handed way. That would be my answer.
Judge Einhorn, any comments?
I do think it is very important that we set examples and standards that we expect other countries and governments to apply. I don't think that every war crimes trial needs to be an international trial. I think concurrent jurisdiction, which does exist under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court and other agencies, should be applied. I think it's very important to use all of the power tools that you have at your command. And I do think that we do have to set a standard. We have a superb justice system where the presumption of innocence applies. We have an excellent corps of lawyers, both civilian and military, on both sides of the issue. We have, if I may say so, a very good judiciary in this country. And I think that we should set an example. And when we're wrong, when we've committed human rights violations ourselves, as a community, as a military, as a political establishment, we need to acknowledge that. The moral credibility of this country is good, but we need it to be great.
Yeah, just quickly, my view is any administration, be it Republican, Democrat, Bush, Obama, you need to be consistent. You need to have consistent policy. Either you're aggressive or you're not. You know, it's philosophical, whatever you want to choose, but be consistent. It doesn't help, in my opinion, to send 100 advisors to Uganda to help with the LRA, but sit back and watch thousands of people die in Syria. It's inconsistent. It doesn't help to be supportive of action in Libya, but watch as Sudan is falling apart and people are being killed. So find your standard, be consistent, because the people expect the United States to lead. They want to know where we are on issues. And you need not be the police of the world, but we need to have a consistent thread of diplomacy so that people know that this is what we expect, and this is what we look for if we're going to have relationships with you as a country.
I have so many wonderful questions here, but I know we are coming close to the end of our discussion. First off, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we are just humbled by the work that you have done, all of you, and we are so grateful that you come to talk to us. So, Ambassador Prosper, I'm just going to leave this last question with you, which is, because you are a Pepperdine alum, we have so many students in this group that are interested in helping in this area. And so what advice might you have for young law students seeking to actually make a difference on the international level?
Yeah, just, that could be a long answer. But just quickly is, be flexible. Keep your eyes open for opportunities. Now that sounds, you hear that all the time, but really, you have to just be aware, because you'll be surprised as to what the possibilities are out there. But more importantly, be prepared to leave your comfort zone. This is your comfort zone. Back in 1994-95, when I first heard about Rwanda and I was considering going, everyone thought I was nuts. I was living on the beach, I had a new car, I had a great life. And then here I'm going to go to a place that just experienced a genocide. We're establishing international tribunals for the first time. There was no career path. It was just completely, off the grid, so to speak. But I took a chance. And this is where I am today. So you will face that opportunity. You don't know when it's going to come across your desk or your computer. But at one point, you'll have to make that choice. Am I prepared to leave my comfort zone and go do something that hasn't been done before, that there's no career path, but is the right thing to do? And when that comes across, you'll know it. And I ask you all to find the courage, to do that. Because a year in a lifetime, or 2 years for that matter, is nothing. But making a difference is something.
Or you could campaign for an unlikely candidate and in 4 states, and then be told when he wins that he's sending you to a small island in the Mediterranean.
Well, we want to thank you so much again. We appreciate all the work you've done and just the words of wisdom and advice. Thank you.